Hi, I'm Paul. For this video, I'm going to talk about uh, spirituality is the complete opposite to narcissism. Now, don't get too worried too much about this narcissism thing, because narcissism is a spectrum. To be, let's say, a full-blown narcissist is quite a far stretch, but I can't help but think that we're all at least somewhat on the spectrum of narcissism. And the complete opposite to narcissism would be what we call spirituality. You see, I studied narcissism for quite a long time. I was so obsessed trying to find out what exactly was narcissism. What really was it? I studied psychology and God knows what else. And all I ever heard was people saying, well, we behave like this is what we do, which was just more stories after stories after stories after stories. And I never found out from anything that I learnt what narcissism actually was until I started trying to observe it myself, and then I made progress, and I finally came out with the answer. What is narcissism? So the answer that I came out with was narcissists don't have access to their soul. Now we're seeing where I'm going. You see, the soul is what we would call the spirituality. Trouble is, I didn't know fully what the soul was at this point. So I had learned that narcissism was the opposite to the soul. Or let's just say narcissism is focusing on something other than the soul. It's still there, but it's not seen. So I had to try and find out what the soul was. I don't believe that the soul is anything that that when you die the soul continues or anything like that. Don't. What I'm saying here, perhaps there's a spirit or something that lives on. I'm not trying to destroy that. I'm just saying the soul itself, I don't think is something that continues to live on. Let's just say, I always like to go back to this brain hemisphere thing. You've got a left brain and a right brain, and the both sides of the brain see things from a different angle. So people who are suffering or so on say, or when they're healed, they say, I've finally found my soul. You see? Go out into nature and we say we're soul searching. You see, to me, narcissism, depending on how we all describe it, we've all got descriptions, but to me, narcissism would be coming from a self-centered space, an enclosed space. You see, the world comes from that space. You see, the angle, the way that you view the world comes from this self-centered space. We could call this self-centered space an image. We don't want to see things which differ from the image. That would be too scary. So we like to translate everything in a way that relates to this image that we have. You see, it's a little bit like wearing rose-colored glasses and noticing that everything looks red. You see, this is kind of the angle that we look at from, perhaps, dare I say, narcissistic view, which I would say would be the left hemisphere, where we see everything in descriptions. We can quite literally change reality, or the way that we see reality, by changing the words we use. You see, many people say, or if you've had experience with people who are narcissistic, that they gaslight, lie, and so on, and I don't think that it's like that. I don't think they realize. They look at things from a different angle, then translate it without realizing that they're translating it in reference to their own image, their own self-center, and then project it outwards. But because of the left hemisphere, I don't think it's really recognized. Let me try and explain that more. There was some tests what we did with people who we split the hemispheres in half. We cut the corpus callosum, and the two hemispheres were... No, I'm telling a lie, sorry. No, we did the test on stroke victims. People who had strokes on the right hemisphere, so that the left hemisphere was the one that was in use, and we found that oh god, if it's right, it'd be left arm. So their left arm was oh god, what do you call it? Paralyzed. So he was unable to move their arm, and the psychologist is speaking to the left hemisphere, saying, "Can you move your arm?" And the left hemisphere is saying, "Yeah, there you go." And then the psychologist says, "But your arm didn't move." And then the left hemisphere just makes another excuse of, "Oh, that arm, that's not my arm, that must be your arm." You see, the left hemisphere is not sitting in reality. It's convinced by its own descriptions. When we look at narcissists and say that they're not in reality and they know it, if you're fixed in this left hemisphere, you don't know it. So the opposite to narcissism, the soul. When I started to look into my own mind at this soul thing, being the right hemisphere, it was probably one of the big shifts that I had towards this spirituality thing. Started to realize that there was something completely different. So in this aspect, I got to admit, I guess, that yes, I would have also been on the narcissistic spectrum, depending on how you describe it. So finding the soul, I started to realize there was a world which was completely different to where I was always living, in a world of descriptions from self-centeredness. So I carried on studying the soul and went further and further, and it seems the rabbit hole goes very, very deep, and it keeps on going. But from the soul perspective, you see, the soul doesn't seem to do the thinking. That's the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere doesn't do any thinking. It sees in images. It doesn't do any shifting in time either, like the left hemisphere does by saying, "I wonder what will happen tomorrow," or so on and so on. It just stays in the present and tries to observe and feel and recognize. So it's much more with reality. I think this is why we say in spirituality that everything is one, because the view from the right hemisphere or the soul, because of the inability of language, it can't divide anything. It can't make images, separation, division. It just sees things how everything is, and everything is one. Yeah, I think the trouble is, these days, is we're just surrounded by people in the left hemisphere, or focusing on the left hemisphere. And this makes it so hard for us to wake up ourselves. Constantly we're getting dragged back down as soon as we're trying to, we go out into nature and start to find a bit of peace and start to find our soul, and then we get back home to face problems and do work that we can't stand doing. Advertisements, television, internet, the worst of all, news. Have you ever really noticed yourself while watching news? You start listening to the chaos on the news and it drives your brain crazy. I mean, really try and observe your brain when watching news. Watch something. Watch something on the news and watch what happens with your brain. I guarantee you, your brain's going to go into thinking mode. It's going to start saying, "Well, that guy's an idiot, that's stupid, I can't believe we're doing this," and so on and so on and so on. There's a guy who I sometimes work with. He comes in to work every day, and every single day he complains about the members of parliament and prime ministers and so on, and how they're doing this and they shouldn't have even done that, and so on. He's been doing this probably for the last 50 years every day at work and never done anything about it. Just every day he changes his own story. Depending on what the story of the news says each day, he just changes. Creating so much hate but never doing anything about it. Try watching your brain when you watch the news. It really does go to show just how easy it is for you to flick into thinking mode and creating images and so on. Perhaps you could go into nature afterwards and stare at nature and see how easy it is to not create images. Well, perhaps you still do, I don't know, but you know, nature's a thing that'll stop you creating the images, the TV and the news and people talking, waffling and speaking complete rubbish. That's what drags you into it. And you see, what I say is anything that's in reality, which is made by thought, can't do anything else other than trigger off your thought. Anything that's in the truth, which is anything that's made, what's not made by thought, you know, trees, animals, grass, the ground, me, other people, anything that's not made by thought speaks directly to your soul. Anything that's made by thought has to speak directly to your left hemisphere, because your left hemisphere is the only bit which does language. So perhaps we might be able to see how is it that we're so stuck in our left hemisphere. You see, our left hemisphere understands language, our right hemisphere doesn't. We get trained from young, go to school, you must think, work harder by thinking and learning more knowledge and so on and so on. All of this is just training your left hemisphere to become more dominant and stronger. Now we're trapped with the trouble of trying to strengthen and move towards our right hemisphere, which is our soul, trying to see the truth in the world. In fact, I'll change that. Trying to see the truth in the corrupt world. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say. Thanks very much for listening.